Answering the Skeptic. What is skepticism? We have all met skeptics who in one way or another have raised doubts about what we can know or reasonably believe. When you assert something, the skeptic responds with, "Says who?" or "How do you know?" There are many different forms of skepticism, and I cannot describe and critique all of them here. For our purposes, let us define the skeptic as someone who does not believe that people have knowledge or rationally justified beliefs. Some skeptics are global skeptics. They hold their skepticism about all beliefs whatever. Others are local in orientation. They may allow for knowledge in certain areas like science or mathematics, while confining their skepticism to, say, ethical or religious claims. Skepticism and the problem of the criterion. In 1984, E. Calvin Beisner wrote a perceptive article in Discipleship Journal in which he claimed that Christians interested in refuting skepticism should learn about what is sometimes called the problem of the criterion. Beisner was right. So we begin our critique by clarifying the problem of the criterion. We can distinguish two different questions relevant to the human quest for knowledge. First is, what is it that we want to know? This is a question about the specific items of knowledge we possess and about the extent or limits of our knowledge. And second, how do we decide in any given case whether or not we have knowledge in that case? What are the criteria for knowledge? This is a question about our criteria for knowledge. Now suppose we want to sort all of our beliefs into two groups, the true or justified ones and the false or unjustified ones, in order to retain the former and dispose of the latter in our entire set of beliefs. Such a sorting would allow us to improve our rational situation and grow in knowledge and justified belief. But now a problem arises regarding how we are to proceed in this sorting activity. It would seem that we would first need an answer to at least one of our two questions. But before we can answer our first question about the extent of our knowledge, we would seem to need an answer to our second question about our criteria for knowledge. Yet before we can answer the second question, we seem to require an answer to our first question. This is the problem of the criterion. If we don't know how we know things, how can we know anything at all or draw limits to human knowledge? But if we don't know some things before we ask ourselves how we can have knowledge in the first place, on what basis will we answer that question? There are three main solutions to the problem. First, there is skepticism. The skeptic claims, among other things, that no good solution to the problem exists, and thus there is no knowledge. The next two solutions are advocated by those who claim that we do have knowledge. Methodism, not the religious denomination, is the name of the second solution, and it has been advocated by philosophers such as John Locke and René Descartes. According to Methodism, one starts the enterprise of knowing with a criterion for what does and does not count as knowledge. That is, we start with an answer to question 2 and not question 1. Methodists claim that before I can know some specific proposition P, for example, there is a tree in the yard, I must first know some general criterion Q, and further I must know that P is a good example of or measures up to Q. For example, Q might be, if you can test some item of belief with the 5 senses, then it can be an item of knowledge. Or perhaps, if something appears to your senses in a certain way, then in the absence of reasons for distrusting the lighting or your senses, you know that the thing is as it appears to you. Unfortunately, Methodism is not a good strategy because it leads to a vicious infinite regress. To see this, note that in general, Methodism implies that before I can know anything, P, I must know 2 other things, Q, my criterion for knowledge, and R, the fact that P satisfies Q. But the skeptic can ask how it is that we know Q and R, and the Methodist will have to offer a new criterion, Q prime, that specifies how he knows Q, and another new criterion, R prime, that tells how he knows that Q satisfies Q prime. Obviously, the same problem will arise for Q prime and R prime, and a vicious regress is set up. Another way to see this is to note that there have been major debates about what are and are not good criteria for knowledge. 17th-century thinker John Locke offered something akin to the notion that an item of knowledge about the external world must pass the criterion of deriving that item of knowledge from simple sensory ideas or impressions, roughly testing it with the senses. By contrast, Locke's counterpart, René Descartes, offered a radically different criterion. The item of knowledge must be clear and distinct when brought before the mind. If we are Methodists, how are we to settle disputes about criteria for knowledge? The answer will be that we will have to offer criteria for our criteria, and so on. It would seem then that Methodism is in trouble. There is a third solution to the problem known as particularism, which is advocated by philosophers such as Thomas Reid, Roderick Chisholm, and G.E. Moore. According to particularists, we start by knowing specific clear items of knowledge. For example, that I had eggs for breakfast this morning, that there is a tree before me, or perhaps that I seem to see a tree, that 7 plus 5 equals 12, that mercy is a virtue, and so on. I can know some things directly and simply without needing criteria for how I know them and without having to know how or even that I know them. We know many things without being able to prove that we do or without fully understanding them. We simply identify clear instances of knowing without having to possess or apply any criteria for knowledge. We may reflect on these instances and go on to develop criteria for knowledge consistent with them, and use these criteria to make judgments in borderline cases of knowledge. But the criteria are justified by their congruence with specific instances of knowledge and not the other way around. For example, I may start with moral knowledge, murder is wrong, and legal knowledge, taxes are to be paid by April 15th, and go on to formulate criteria for when something is moral or legal. I could then use these criteria for judging borderline cases, intentionally driving on the wrong side of the street, for example. In general, we start with clear instances of knowledge, formulate criteria based on those clear instances, and extend our knowledge by using those criteria in borderline, unclear cases. Rebutting the skeptic. The skeptic can raise two basic objections against the particularist. First, the particularist allegedly begs the question against the skeptic by simply assuming his answer to the point at issue, whether we have knowledge. The skeptic asks, how does the particularist know that we have this knowledge? Isn't it possible in the cases cited above that the particularist is wrong and only thinks he has knowledge? Particularists respond to this objection as follows. First, regarding begging the question, if the skeptic doesn't offer a reason for his skepticism, and just keeps asking, how do you know, each time the particularist makes a knowledge claim, his skepticism can be ignored, because it is not a substantive position or argument. If, on the other hand, his skepticism is the result of an argument, then this argument must be reasonable before it can be held as a serious objection against knowledge. However, if we did not know some things, we could not reasonably doubt anything. For example, the reason for doubting my senses now is my knowledge that they have misled me in the past. Therefore, unbridled skepticism is not a rationally defensible position, and it cannot be rationally asserted and defended without presupposing knowledge. Second, the skeptic tries to force the particularist to become a Methodist by asking the "how do you know" question, since the skeptic is implying that before you can know, you must have criteria for knowledge. And the skeptic knows he can refute the Methodist. But the particularist will resist the slide into Methodism by reaffirming that he can know some specific item without having to say how he knows it. For example, the particularist will say, I know that mercy is a virtue and not a vice, even if I don't know how it is that I know this. But, Mr. Skeptic, why think that I have to know how I know this before I can know it? Further, the particularist argues that just because it is logically possible that he is mistaken in a specific case of knowledge, that does not mean he is mistaken, or that he has any good reason to think he is wrong. And until the skeptic can give him good reason for thinking his instances of knowledge fail, the mere logical possibility that he is wrong will not suffice. Suppose I claim to know about the time and event when I first went to Disneyland several years ago. In response, the skeptic tries to show I don't really know this by raising the possibility that I might have been born 5 seconds ago with a memory, and that my memory is deceiving me. The particularist will respond this way. Just because the statement J.P. Moreland was born 5 seconds ago with a memory is not a logical contradiction, like J.P. Moreland is and is not a human being, and could be true as a bare logical possibility, that does not mean we have good reasons for actually believing the statement is correct. The particularist will insist that unless there are good reasons for believing the skeptic's claim, and the skeptic doesn't give such reasons, the bare possibility that it might be true is not sufficient to call into question what I actually know about my Disneyland visit. The particularist and skeptic have very different approaches to knowledge. For the skeptic, the burden of proof is on the one who claims to know something. If it is logically possible that one might be mistaken, then knowledge is not present because knowledge requires complete 100% certainty. Of the 2 main tasks in the quest for knowledge, obtaining true or justified beliefs and avoiding false or unjustified beliefs, the skeptic elevates the latter and requires that his position be refuted before knowledge can be justified. To refute something is to show that it is wrong. The skeptic thinks avoiding error is better than gaining truth and thinks he must be shown wrong before anyone can claim to know anything. The particularist elevates the value of gaining as many truths as are available in the world and tries to rebut the skeptic. To rebut something is not to show that it is wrong, but simply to show that the skeptic has not adequately shown that it is true. After all, the particularist recognizes that we all know many things before we ever talk to skeptics. He places the burden of proof on the skeptic and requires the skeptic to show that his skepticism is true and should be taken seriously before he allows the skeptic to bother him about knowledge. The particularist does not need to refute the skeptic, show skepticism is false. He merely needs to rebut the skeptic, show that the skeptic has not adequately made his case for skepticism. Given that the skeptic cannot consistently argue for his skepticism, there is no reason to deny what is obvious to all of us, that we do know many things. One skeptic's story.